Let's take a look at college football 26 versus college football 25 side by side. This is mainly going to be comparing visuals, small details, and some of the player movement. So let's start with player movement because there has been some conversations about this. It might not come across much on screen. However, I do think college football 26 is just a tad bit slower than 25. Now, that's not to say that the game still isn't very fast. You could see changing direction here. It does feel like 25 was just a slight bit faster, a slight bit snappier, but some could argue that 25 was a little too arcade, and this kind of balanced it just a little bit. The game's still very fast, but if you notice jukes and spins especially, you can tell they're not as fast as they were last year. They're just a little bit slower. They're not as snappy as last year, but overall player movement still feels good, responsive, and the left stick still feels rewarding. And here's an example of two running backs with the platinum shifty ability, because this does make you change directions quicker. You could see speed-wise, I mean, it's very much the same. Like I said, maybe a tad bit slower this year, but it's still very fast. You could see changing direction with shifty was a little bit easier last year, but it's still good this year. Another small thing you may have noticed is that they did finally update the kicking animation. It's a small difference, but I think you notice it more when playing than looking at a side-by-side. But this is the first time that a kicking animation from an EA game has been updated in quite some time. Now, one of the biggest changes for me is the overhauled QB animations, the throwing, the releases. You can really tell how much smoother and better the ball comes out of the QB's hands now. It kind of had like this weird warping effect before, almost looked a little glitchy if you really slow it down and look at it. Now the ball comes out a lot more properly, I guess you could say, and it just looks more realistic. They've also added a bunch of different throwing animations to differentiate QBs. So right here, for example, you can trigger no-look animations in the pocket. This might be based on QB ratings or abilities, potentially. I don't know if every QB can do it. On the run as well, there's just a ton of different new animations now. Before, there were just a certain amount of release animations for these QBs, both in the pocket, on the run, deep shots. Now there's probably at least 3 times as many of these different releases for these different situations, and they've just overhauled them all to make them look more realistic, and I think this is one of the best changes they made this year. Now let's get into some of the details and presentation things. So for the team intros, they did redo a lot of the ones from last year to make them more authentic. You could see even the crowd was updated. We don't have that same crowd member anymore that was at like every single game. The crowds are a lot more diverse now and just look overall better. But for a lot of the teams, even teams as big as Oklahoma, they've added on to the intros, making them a little bit better than last year. Not everybody got an updated intro, but they're kind of working on building out, making each one even more specific and adding as many details as possible. Here's another example for Texas Tech. You could see pretty drastic difference between last year and this year. Again, they're going to continue building these out for teams, adding more specific things, making them more in detail as years go on, but just showing a couple examples here of how they've changed some of the team intros. They didn't just kind of copy and paste every team introduction over from last year. And they've also done a lot of work with night intros. Now, for every team, they're not going to have a specialized night intro, but a decent amount of teams do. They have light shows now that flicker around for a lot of these bigger teams, and you can see it just makes the introduction in a night game more epic, which it is in real life. In real life, these night games are huge in college football, and so now they're just trying to add more lighting effects in the crowd, in the stadium, for the runouts and things like that, so you could see just looks a lot better than it did last year. And for some teams like Arizona State right here, for example, you could see they've got drone shows going off at night. There's a number of teams that have stuff like that, so just a little bit of an extra touch on top of the introductions that they continue to build out. And another part of the introductions this year are band formations. There were a few in the game last year, but they've added a lot more for a lot of teams this year to just make it look better. Now, in terms of like pre-game graphics and stuff like that, you can see on the left, that's pretty much what you got for every game, just a spotlight of the player. Now, on the right, you're seeing some new stuff that we have this year. Here's another example of that. You're going to see different ones each game. There's a few different options, so it makes each game feel a little bit different. Now here's just a side-by-side graphical look of the Notre Dame helmet. A lot of people have mentioned how much better it looks this year. So again, these things should look better year to year. You should see the graphics improve at least a little bit, and you could see just lighting-wise and how they look. Overall, it just looks better this year, and you could see it really good here in this snow entrance that I did. Just look at the shine on the helmets. I mean, a lot better looking than it was last year, but that's something you expect. This should get better each year, and it did. Another thing that greatly improved this year was the snow. It looks so much better this year than it did last year, falling through the air and even how it piles up on the ground. I still think they could make this even better, but this is a nice jump forward. Now, in terms of the rain, I don't really see much of a difference here. Obviously, there's some different lighting in the two videos, but the rain itself looks to be pretty much untouched. Moving on to dirty jerseys in game. So this is college football 25, halfway through the game. You can see the jerseys are a little bit dirty. They did get some dirt on them last year. Again, you could see a little bit here, but for an all-white jersey, you kind of expect it to be dirtier than that. Now here in college football 26, halfway through the game, you're noticing that the jerseys get a lot dirtier, and they even get dirtier than this. I've seen them get pretty crazy, but you could see now pretty big difference from last year, and this is something that people care about in terms of the details of the game. But not every jersey is going to look exactly the same dirty-wise as others. As you can see, some have less than others. Maybe it's a snaps played type of thing. I'm not sure. So now let's look at player likeness side by side. These are just a few examples of last year versus this year for certain players. They did update the faces for a number of players, but keep in mind, they're not using face scans. They're not going to be perfect. Some of them got really big upgrades this year, as you could see, but they're using AI in photos and things like that. Arch Manning, for example, I think face-wise looks a lot better than last year, but not everybody's going to be spot-on accurate because they're not using official face scans, because you can't face scan 12,000 players. Here's a look at some of the cover boys here. They got slight differences. Theirs aren't too major, in my opinion. Here's a big one. DJ Lagway looks way more like himself this year than he did last year. And also do keep in mind, there are going to be a lot of the freshmen or really lower rated players that are not going to look too much like themselves right now. The same thing happened last year. They're going to update these in the first couple of updates as the game progresses, because they got to go in and continue fine-tuning some of the newer players that came in. Because when you've got 12,000 players, I mean, at the end of the day, it's just going to take a while to get everybody looking decent. Here's an area where they did improve for a number of players, the body type. So you could see Nico Iamaleava looks a lot more like himself this year in terms of his body type, because they did add a new lean archetype. And they also did slim down the flak jackets a little bit for some of these QBs, so they don't look as bulky as they did last year. Also, you'll notice it looks like they kind of adjusted helmet sizes for a lot of guys, so the helmets look more proportional. However, they can still get better with a lot of this, in my opinion. I do think they made an improvement for a lot of players, but you can still see some players kind of look like they have no neck. I heard that that was an issue that they are working on, and we should get it patched soon. Also, they need to slim the pads down for some of these players. Like, for example, I think Arch, outside of the flak jacket, looked better last year body type than this year, and some of that is just the pads being really big, but I do think he's one that they need to slim down a little bit more. But overall, they did make an improvement here for a number of players. Now let's look at dynamic lighting, one of the better presentation updates this year. So here you can see in the first quarter of 2 games here at Tulane. Then we go to the second quarter. You can see shadows starting to change, sky getting a little bit darker in 26. And here you go the third quarter. It's dark outside in college football 26. In 25, it's still light outside. So this is definitely one of my favorite changes. Here's something else I noticed. The QB walk-ups this year, they seem to be a little bit more varied. Last year, it seemed like they kind of did the same thing most of the time, whereas this year, seems like there's some more variation there. And here's another big upgrade is the side-by-side broadcast view, and really the reason for that is because if you notice, the defensive players this year, they move around and communicate pre-snap. This is actually something that was in Madden last year, and they've now carried it over to college football, but it just makes the game look a lot more realistic because the defense isn't just standing still and just static the whole time. So here is an example. Look at 25 last year, and just look at the defense. They kind of are just in their spot. They're standing still. Now in 26, you see they move around more, they communicate, and it just makes the game look more real. Here's a look at the sidelines in college football 25. This is an area also I think EA could really improve on. I know that it's really memory intensive with just how many players are in the crowd, sidelines, and stadiums. Here's 26, but I do think they can make it better. They did add a slight bit more detail this year. We have players wearing towels and things like that, but mostly still the same. Here's something else I thought was pretty cool and unique. So last year in 25, if you kicked a field goal on the road, this is what the big board would look like at the top. Now this year, you'll see that they try to distract you with mascots and things like that. Small detail, but I thought it was pretty cool that they added that. Now, I wanted to look at Road to Glory a little bit. Of course, we know they added high school. They added a little bit more to the recruiting process, which is cool and all. However, the customization in terms of your playing styles, how you throw the ball and all that stuff, look at all the options they have this year versus last year. Just for throwing alone, and this also plays into regular QBs, a lot more throwing styles this year. Also, you can see there's ball carrying style, run styles, QB stance in the shotgun and under center. You can adjust your halfback stance, your wide receiver stance, linebacker, cornerback stance. So now there is a lot more customization in at least how your player is presented in terms of how they stand, how they run, how they release the ball. So they did pretty good work with this in customizing the player. Now they just need to up the equipment a little bit more and we'd really be cooking. Here's the Dynasty screen side by side. Now, in terms of the UI, it looks the same. I don't really have a problem with that. I don't think you need to update the UI just for the sake of it. If it works good, just keep rolling with it. They did add, obviously, more options like formation subs. They added a lot more league history for awards and bowl winners and all that stuff, which is really good. They updated recruiting, of course, made it a little bit more difficult, unlocked the transfer portal just a little bit more. So they did make obvious changes to Dynasty, but in terms of just looks, outside of the coach standing on the side of the screen now, UI-wise, it's pretty much the same, but I think the UI works. You don't have to mess with it if it's working, in my opinion. So that's what that looks like. But in terms of coach customization and how he looks, they did a big change here, as most of you probably know by now. You had 2 options last year, that's it. But this year, you've got a ton more. Now, right here is a look at the National Championship pregame intro. So they did change it up just a little bit. It's not a drastic difference, I don't think. You got some different angles of stuff. You got some shots that still look like they're about the same, but just some slight differences here. I would say not a crazy change. It's basically same formula as last year, maybe just some slightly different angles at certain parts, but basically going to be about the same thing. So just let it play out here so you can look at them side by side and just get a kind of a visual of what the pregame for the national championship game is looking like. Obviously, it is in a different stadium this year. That is a change, but they're going to do that every year. They're moving to a different stadium, so that's to be expected. But otherwise, mostly the same for the pregame here. Now, in terms of the championship celebration, this one is a little bit different than the pregame. It still has kind of the same vibe, a lot of similar shots, maybe from different angles, but there are some different shots in here. It's a little bit different than last year, which is good to see. You want to see them change it up at least a little bit and not just completely copy and paste it over, because there were a lot of years with Madden, for example, where they did copy and paste the Super Bowl celebration clip for clip, angle for angle for like 4 to 5 years. So they've been changing it up a little bit more recently, but here we get a slight change, which is nice. I think I would just like to see them just have a few different versions of this for, for both games even, and just replay them throughout the year so you're not seeing, the same one all year long. Now, there's a ton of other really small, cool details that they added to the game this year that most of you probably don't know about. Check out this video right here on the screen where I break down all the little things that you don't know are in this game.